The city of Boston in the early 1960s presented a facade of steadfast tradition and intellectual vigor, a world of red brick and ivy-covered walls where history felt palpable on every corner, from the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill to the bustling academic corridors of its world-renowned universities. This was a city that prided itself on its decorum and its deep-rooted sense of community, a place where people still largely trusted their neighbors and felt secure behind the locked doors of their apartments. Yet, beneath this serene surface, a profound and paralyzing fear was about to take root, a terror that would systematically dismantle the sense of safety for an entire demographic of women living alone across the city and its suburbs. It began quietly on a warm June evening in 1962, when 55-year-old Anna Slezers, a Latvian immigrant and devoted mother, failed to answer a phone call from her concerned son. When he arrived at her third-floor apartment on Gainsborough Street, he discovered a scene of unimaginable horror that would become the grisly template for a series of crimes that would forever stain the city's history. Anna Slezers lay on her bathroom floor, the belt of her own housecoat tied around her neck in an elaborately precise bow, the kind one might use to adorn a gift rather than to extinguish a life. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled, yet her apartment showed no signs of a struggle or forced entry. A cup of tea sat half-finished on the counter, and the radio played softly in the background, creating a chilling dissonance between the mundane domesticity of the scene and the brutal violence that had occurred within it. The killer had not broken in, he had been let in, suggesting a familiarity or a ruse so convincing that a cautious woman would willingly open her door to a stranger after dark. This method of operation, the silent entry, the sexual violence, the signature ligature tied with theatrical flourish, would become a horrifying pattern repeated with slight variations across 11 more murders over the next 2 years, each crime adding another layer of dread to the atmosphere of a city held hostage by an unseen predator. The second victim, 68-year-old Mary Mullen, died of a heart attack believed to have been induced by the sheer terror of an attempted assault just days after Slezers' murder, though this was only the beginning of the death toll that would soon consume the city's attention. She was followed in rapid succession by 65-year-old Helen Blake, found strangled with her own stockings in her sterile apartment, and then by 75-year-old Ida Oger, discovered on her bed with a pillowcase and 2 of her own stockings knotted around her neck in a display of macabre efficiency. The victims were predominantly older women, living alone in the densely packed apartment buildings of Boston's working-class neighborhoods, their vulnerabilities seemingly mapped out by a killer who moved through the city with ghost-like invisibility. The police initially struggled to connect the crimes, attributing them to copycats or isolated incidents of violence, but the chilling similarities in method soon forced them to confront the terrifying reality that a single prolific serial killer was hunting with impunity in their city. As winter approached in 1895, Aurelio Calderone made a decision that would echo through the decades and eventually reach the ears of a young American journalist 4 decades later. He called his daughters together in the main room of their stone farmhouse and presented them with what he called a sacred duty. He had found, he told them, the perfect solution to preserve their bloodline while ensuring its continuation. The sisters would share a single husband, a distant cousin named Rodrigo Calderone, whom he had located in a village near Santander. Rodrigo, he assured them, was of pure Calderone blood, traced back through his grandfather to the same ancestor they all shared. What Aurelio didn't tell his daughters was that Rodrigo Calderone was not a distant cousin at all. He was Aurelio's own son by his deceased sister, a fact that would make him the girl's half-brother. The deception was carefully crafted, supported by forged documents that Aurelio had spent months preparing. In his twisted logic, this arrangement would not only preserve their bloodline but would actually purify it further, creating children whose genetic heritage would be more concentrated than any in their family's history. The arrangement he proposed was methodical and cold in its calculation. Each sister would spend 1 month as Rodrigo's primary wife, while the other 2 served as companions and assistants. Any children born from these unions would be raised collectively with their specific parentage deliberately obscured to prevent favoritism. The sisters would live together in harmony, united in their sacred mission to create the purest possible offspring. Elena, ever the dutiful daughter, accepted immediately. Magdalena voiced concerns but was quickly silenced by her father's theological arguments about divine will and family honor. Only Esperanza seemed to understand the full horror of what was being proposed, but her protests were dismissed as the hysteria of youth. Within a month, Rodrigo Calderón had arrived from Santander, a hollow-eyed man of 35, who seemed to understand his role all too well. The winter of 1896 brought with it a silence that seemed to swallow the entire Calderón Valley. The first snows had fallen earlier than usual, sealing the family's stone farmhouse away from the outside world until spring. It was during these months of complete isolation that the true nature of Aurelio's plan began to reveal itself, and what had seemed merely disturbing evolved into something far more sinister. Rodrigo Calderón had arrived in November, just as the mountain passes were becoming treacherous. He was a man marked by hardship, his face weathered beyond his years, and his hands bearing the calluses of someone who had known manual labor since childhood. But there was something else about him, a peculiar intensity in his dark eyes, and a way of speaking that suggested he understood far more about the Calderón family's true history than he initially let on. The arrangement began exactly as Aurelio had planned. Elena, as the eldest, was given the first month to establish herself as Rodrigo's primary wife. The ceremony that united them was performed by Aurelio himself using a combination of Catholic ritual and what he claimed were ancient family traditions passed down from their Gothic ancestors. There were no outside witnesses, no civil registration, no connection to the church in Cangas de Onís. It was in every legal sense not a marriage at all, but rather a carefully orchestrated breeding arrangement disguised as religious duty. What happened during that first month would haunt the valley for decades to come. Elena, who had always been the most compliant of the sisters, began to change in ways that neither Magdalena nor Esperanza could understand. She became secretive, whispering with Rodrigo in corners of the house and developing what could only be described as an obsession with their father's genealogical charts. She spent hours copying names and dates, creating elaborate family trees that showed the theoretical genetic makeup of any children she might bear. With DeSalvo's detailed confession in hand, the authorities quickly moved to close the case, announcing to the relieved public that the Boston Strangler had been identified and was in custody, effectively ending the largest manhunt in the city's history. DeSalvo was never actually tried for the Strangler murders. Instead, he was convicted on unrelated armed robbery and sexual assault charges and sentenced to life in prison, where he was murdered by a fellow inmate in 1973, under circumstances that remain suspicious and poorly explained to this day. The official narrative became that Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler, a lone, monstrous figure whose capture restored safety and order to the streets of Boston, allowing the city to collectively heal and move forward from its traumatic experience. However, almost from the moment DeSalvo began his confession, nagging doubts began to emerge among those closest to the investigation, doubts that have only grown stronger with the passage of time and the application of modern forensic techniques. Several of the original detectives on the task force believed that the 13 murders attributed to the Strangler were the work of at least 2 different killers, pointing to stark differences in victimology, methods of operation, and the apparent physical strength required for the crimes. Some of the earlier murders of older women showed evidence of extreme personal rage and a familiarity with the victims that was absent from the later killings of younger women, which seemed more impulsive and less controlled in their execution. DeSalvo's knowledge of crime scene details could have been gleaned from newspaper reports, police gossip, or even from being coached by investigators desperate to close the cases, casting a long shadow over the validity of his entire confession. The most compelling evidence against DeSalvo's sole responsibility emerged decades later, when DNA testing unavailable at the time of the murders was finally conducted on evidence preserved from the crime scene of Mary Sullivan, the Strangler's final victim. The results conclusively excluded Albert DeSalvo as the source of the semen found at the scene, providing scientific proof that he could not have been the killer in at least one of the 13 attributed murders. This revelation reopened the case to intense scrutiny, suggesting that DeSalvo may have been a compulsive confessor seeking notoriety, or that he may have been involved in some of the crimes but not all of them, leaving the terrifying possibility that the real Boston Strangler or Stranglers escaped justice entirely. The DNA evidence forced official recognition that the truth was far more complex than the tidy narrative that had been presented to the public 50 years earlier. The mystery of the Boston Strangler endures as a dark and complex puzzle, a case that represents both a failure of justice and a fascinating study in how public pressure can shape the narrative of an investigation. It is a story of two phantoms, the original killer who moved through the city unseen, and the confessed killer whose identity provided a convenient but potentially false closure to a traumatized population. The questions far outnumber the answers. Was Albert DeSalvo a pathological liar craving fame, or did he possess some genuine involvement in the crimes that allowed him to learn the details he provided? If he was not the Strangler, how did he know the intimate specifics of the murder scenes that had been kept secret? And most chillingly, if the real killer or killers were never caught, did they simply stop their activities, or did they move on to other cities and other crimes, their identities protected by DeSalvo's sensational confession and subsequent murder? The Boston Strangler case remains a haunting open file in the annals of American crime, a reminder that the desire for closure can sometimes overwhelm the pursuit of truth, and that the monsters among us are often more complex and elusive than we want to believe. The women he killed deserve more than a convenient solution. They deserve the truth, no matter how inconvenient or complex it may be to uncover. Their stories and the story of the city they lived in remain frozen in time, waiting for a final answer that may never come. What do you believe? Was Albert DeSalvo the Boston Strangler, or was he a convenient liar who allowed the real killer to escape justice? Could modern DNA technology solve the other murders, or has the truth been lost to history? Share your theory in the comments below. The archives of the Penance Files are always open for discussion, and if you believe that justice requires us to question even settled history, subscribe and tap the notification bell. Tomorrow we open another file. Thank you for listening.